Hello and welcome to what promises to be the most special segment. I know this is definitely the most eagerly awaited segment. Today we're joined by a host of venerable luminaries from different nations. And therefore, in order to introduce them, I thought it only befitting to invite the senior most person in our organization, not in terms of age, but in terms of designation and position. He's someone who needs little introduction and is probably the finest representative of our country internationally, and one of the best brand ambassadors of India. I think if there is one man who can start off the dialogue, it is this person. He's former Under Secretary General of the United Nations, Minister of State for External Affairs, and has donned many hats. But the man who always has the $5 million smile is the chairman of the Board of Advisors at IIMUN. Therefore, it gives me great pleasure and privilege in order to be able to welcome for his opening remarks and to introduce the panel, none other than Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Dr. Tharoor, welcome.
Thank you very much, Risha, for that extraordinarily unnecessarily generous introduction, but you're very kind. We are, in fact, far more honored to have with us 5 former heads of government and heads of state who have joined us today. And I think it's to them that you must reserve, as I'm sure you will, the highest respect. We're delighted to see before us today, honoring IIMUN with their presence, His Excellency Bertie Ahern, the former Prime Minister of Ireland, His Excellency Emil Constantinescu, the former President of Romania, His Excellency Ivo Josipovic, the former President of Croatia, His Excellency Dr. Igor Luksic, the former Prime Minister of Montenegro, and Her Excellency Dr. Sibel Siba, former Prime Minister of Northern Cyprus. So you really have some very distinguished people who have come to share their thoughts on multilateralism in a conversation with you, Rishabh Shah, before 35,000 students. And I don't want to make these preliminary remarks excessively long, and there is no point in reciting the usual platitudes about multilateralism, because these are very distinguished figures who have 2 or 3 of whom I've already met at the United Nations during my time there, and they know well how multilateralism works. Rather, I will argue as to why this conversation is so relevant, because I do believe that the COVID-19 pandemic that has assailed the world in the course of the last year has, I'm afraid, inaugurated an era of deglobalization that threatens multilateralism as never before. And that threat is from the fact that, that there are more and more signs of the world embracing isolationism and protectionism than it would have been inclined to do prior to the outbreak. The indications emerged from the pandemic. The pandemic has confirmed for many that in times of crisis, people rely on their own governments to shield them, that global supply chains are vulnerable to disruption and are therefore unsustainable, their dependence on foreign countries for essential goods, such as pharmaceuticals, for example, or even, the US discovered, I remember at the beginning of the first Chinese lockdown, that 100% of their ibuprofen was imported from China. And suddenly they worried what Americans would do about their headaches. Or India discovered that though we are a leading world manufacturer of pharmaceuticals, we import many of the chemical ingredients that go into making them from other countries. And all of these things suddenly made people wake up to their dependence on other countries, and they started rushing to reset global supply chains, raise trade barriers, bring in more production and value chains and manufacturing back home, or at least closer to home. And I'm sorry to say we're seeing this even today, a year later, with the competitive rush for vaccine supplies that each nation understandably wants for its own people. But the notion of international cooperation seems to be far removed. We have some European leaders here. They will surely want to introspect about the fact that Europe has long been seen as a global poster child, as it were, for multilateral cooperation on the regional scale. And yet, when the COVID pandemic struck, the first victim was the Schengen arrangement. Immediately, the notion of passport-free, border-free travel between Schengen member countries disappeared as the barriers went up. Everyone said, we have to protect our own people from infection from outside. Now, this kind of attitude is now widespread, and it's linked economically because, of course, The open system of free trade has been threatened by this. World goods trade shrank by 10 to 30% last year. More and more desire to try and become insular in their focus. Some countries convince themselves that foreigners are to be feared, that strict border and immigration controls are essential, that countries cannot always expect useful help from their neighbors and allies, and that national interest should always trump international cooperation. I use the verb trump because President Trump, as we all know, took that to the next level by pulling the US out of the World Health Organization at a time when a global pandemic should have meant, or we would have expected it to mean, that countries would come closer together to fight this global pandemic. Instead, the leading country, the leading donor of WHO, pulled out from that organization. And this is the kind of worry that I see. They also pulled out, of course, of the Paris Climate Accords. And many countries, the message was going out from governments that the only answer to the pandemic lies in strong government, in putting the nation's needs over individual citizens' freedoms, and in dispensing with democratic niceties from federalism to parliamentary oversight to multilateralism. Now, here we have a challenge, because when you see that kind of phenomenon going on, and you also see, for example, the otherization, as it were, of people who are foreign, multilateralism inevitably is a casualty, and the COVID-19 pandemic was a mega shock to the global system, one that has, in my view, really exposed and created certain cracks in the existing world order. As sovereignties are reasserted across the world and treaties and trade agreements increasingly questioned, I really fear that multilateralism could be the next casualty. This is why this discussion is so important at this particular point of time, because we don't want that what happened with the US, which is a warning call to all of us. The withdrawal from the WHO could have become a harbinger of a greater unraveling to follow of the international system so painstakingly constructed after World War II. But fortunately, we now have a new American president who's announced that the US will return to WHO. So for the moment, the immediate danger has been arrested. Similarly, in Europe, when Europe seemed divided over a rescue package, they were able finally to agree on a $750 billion package. So things have been held back from the worst happening, but the warning shots have been fired across the bow of multilateralism. And I would say that my biggest worry, which I wrote some months ago, was that instead of strengthening the capacity of our global institutions to cope with the future crisis, the world's reaction to the virus may well end up destroying the most fundamental feature that it has exposed, which is the idea of our common humanity. I really hope that this very distinguished panel, which I gather has also been joined by another distinguished former Prime Minister, His Excellency Rui Duarte de Barros of Guinea-Bissau, that all of this, the five former Prime Ministers and Presidents who are speaking today will address this challenge. I have laid down a set of markers which they may wish to disagree with. I hope, in fact, that some of them will say that I'm being unnecessarily alarmist, but I do believe it was important to call the shots the way I see them and to explain why this conversation about multilateralism requires a certain urgency, because your successors in the governments of your countries, and indeed people here in India, will all have to understand through this conversation moderated by the IIMUN why it is that multilateral cooperation is more essential than ever if we are to make a better world in the post-COVID era. With those words, I thank you all very much, and I hand you back to Rishabh Shah.
Thank you, sir, for that wonderful opening address. So what you mentioned in many a way, and you put it articulately, as always, about multilateralism and the way going forward. Today, in a day and age of anti-globalization, countries are looking more and more inward. And they're not looking inwards the way Mahatma Gandhi told us to look inwards. And I quote, the father of our nation said this: our greatest ability as humans is not to change the world, but to change ourselves. The problem is, we're in the race of coming first, we are forgetting that our moral responsibility and our duty and obligation is in order to make sure that we unite nations. And in that small way, try to change ourselves so that we can fit in the global order. Now, this entire conversation, the next 20-25 minutes, is going to be very, very interesting, all thanks to these opening remarks that you've just made. Dr. Shashi Tharoor, it's been a pleasure to be able to host you once again. Thank you, sir.